A man who built his empire from a single drop of whiskey. Everybody knows, like a whiskey on the rocks, something like that. His name became one of the most recognized brands in the world. But the thing that ultimately took his life was not a business rival, not an accident involving his product, and not even old age. And the legend actually started with a toe, hence why we care so much about podiatry. Welcome to another episode of Diabetic Foot Files, where we examine the hidden history behind wounds, infection, limb loss, and the science of saving limbs. So today we're going to open the historical wound file of the case of Jack Daniels. Everybody knows, Jack Daniels whiskey. So a story that sounds pretty much impossible. A small injury, a toe infection, a bloodstream infection, and a death. I actually have to do my research on this. I never learned about this all these years in foot health, but behind the legend is a medical lesson that still stays relevant today. A wound is not just a wound, and also podiatry is extremely important. So let's dive into it. So, who was Jack Daniels? So, Jack Daniels was born, his name is actually Jasper Newton Daniel. He was born in 1846. Really cool name. I love it. Jasper Newton Daniel, better known to the world as Jack Daniel. He was born in, they said around 1850, okay? But I just said 1846, around 1850 in Tennessee. His exact birth date is uncertain, and that was not unusual for the time. I told you I have a patient who had two birthdays the day she was born because it was like born in the olden days in a house, and then she had their documented birthday, which is when she got registered. So he grew up during the time of enormous change in America. So the Civil War, of course, reshaped the South. The industry expanded. There were railroads connected, okay, that connected towns, and entrepreneurs who adapted to the times to help rebuild remarkable businesses. And Jack Daniels was one of them. So he apprenticed under Lutheran minister and a distiller. That's a very interesting combination. Named Nathan, and he had expertise in whiskey making, profoundly influenced the whiskey industry, and that's helped whiskey become famous around the world. And Jack eventually founded what became Jack Daniels Distillery in Lynchburg, Tennessee. So his whiskey wasn't the first American whiskey, but it became one of the best known. So today, millions of bottles of Jack Daniels is sold every year around like 170 countries, making the brand name one of the most recognizable spirits in history. Yet, despite building an empire, he had no children, unfortunately, and he never married. But they always, I mean, let me not get into that. And because they say a happy man is not married, right? Something like that. But in 1911, approximately at 61 years, he died, and it wasn't from alcoholism or cirrhosis or from a shooting, but reportedly from complications of an infected foot that progressed to gangrene and blood poisoning. My grandmother died of blood poisoning. And this is a term commonly used at that time for modern medicine, what we recognize as sepsis today. So he founded what became one of the world's most famous whiskey brands, right? He's known for his attention to detail, his craftsmanship, his innovation, and building a global business from Lynchburg, Tennessee. But in 1911, at approximately 65 years old, he died. And they said the official cause reported said blood poisoning, but what we today say is called sepsis. So what is the famous story? And I hope everybody understands, like, if you have something going wrong with your foot, go to the podiatrist immediately. So the famous story goes, Jack Daniels arrived at work early one morning. This is how the story goes, okay? I cannot confirm it. I cannot ask him. I cannot ask his children because he doesn't have any. Okay, so I'm just going by what I've researched. Okay, so Jack Daniels arrived at work early one morning, needed to access his safe. So the combination of the safe would not work. So he got frustrated, and as the story goes, and maybe this is an urban legend, I'm not sure, he kicked the safe. The injury hit his toe, right? He kicked the safe with his foot. He injured his toe. Then it became infected. The infection worsened, and eventually it spread through his body, and he died, unfortunately. But history requires caution, of course. Was the safe actually the true incident that caused the toe infection? Obviously, they didn't say anything about diabetes. We may never know. But medically, the story represents something very real. A small foot injury can become something catastrophic, like a catastrophic infection. But if podiatry was there, I think we would have helped. Okay. But did you know a lot of people assume that Jack Daniels died because he spent his life making whiskey. Ironically, historical records do not support any alcohol related liver failure as his cause of death. Instead, the contemporary accounts consistently point towards the infection following a foot injury, although the exact sequence of events remains debated. So, the safe. So let's talk about it. So according to the most famous version of his death, right? Jack arrived to work early one morning. He attempted to open the office safe. He couldn't remember the combination. He got frustrated. He kicked the heavy iron safe with his right foot and immediately he injured one of his toes. The wound became infected, the infection spread, gangrene developed, and eventually he died in a dramatic, memorable way. But it repeatedly almost everywhere, but hysteria, like I said, they have caution when it comes to this. But some accounts suggest that the kicking the safe incident happened years before his fatal incident. Others suggest the injury may have contributed to chronic problems rather than directly causing the infection that led to his death. But without an official autopsy report, none has been found in the historical record. We cannot state with certainty that kicking the safe alone caused death. But we've seen patients like kick things out of anger and injure their toe or broken their toe, things like that. But what we can say that he died after developing they say that he died after developing gangrene and an overwhelming infection. Whether the kicking of the safe initiated the event or simply became a legend, the medical principles are the same. Go to podiatry and wound care. And yeah, principles matter today, especially when it comes to anything that has to do with go to podiatry, go to your wound care specialist. We're here for you. So, could a stub toe actually kill you? At first glance, it may seem absurd. Everybody thinks it's just a foot, it's just a toe, right? How could a minor injury become fatal? To answer that, we need to understand what happens beneath the skin the moment tissue is damaged. So picture your toe, your beautiful big toe. Let's use the big toe. And it's covered with skin. Remember, our skin is like a fortress wall. It protects its, protective organ. And the skin is not just a covering, right? Remember, it's the largest organ in our body and one of our body's most effective defense mechanisms, right, against infection. So, as long as the skin remains intact, countless bacteria living on the skin or in the environment are kept outside. But the instant the barrier of the skin is broken, the rules change. So, even like a cracked toenail, a blister, a puncture wound, a cut from trimming nails, a scrape from inside a shoe, or even a forceful blow that can cause bleeding underneath. Each of these create opportunities. The damaged skin releases an alarm, of course. The blood vessels dilate, the white blood cells race to the scene, platelets form a clot. The body launches its inflammatory response designed to heal, right? But most of the time, this process works beautifully. But if bacteria gains a foothold or if blood flow is poor, the balance pretty much does shift. And the very inflammation that is meant to protect you to help the beginning of getting rid of the infection, you know, it can actually harm you. So did Jack Daniels really kick us safe? Did the injury ultimately cause his life? Like I said, historians still debate exactly how the foot became infected, but little bit dispute that he developed gangrene and physicians say that he had blood poisoning, which is aka what we call sepsis today. So how could something so harmless like a stub toe become something as and life-threatening as the infection, right? So for many people, a stub toe is just an inconvenience. I stubbed my toe. I've never met anybody who hasn't stubbed their toe. Everybody's pretty much stubbed their toe, and what we do, we like walk it off, and we're like all that stuff, right? But for others, especially our patients with diabetes, poor circulation, or even a weakened immune system, if you stub your toe, it does become the first chapter in a medical emergency. So that's why prevention is better than cure. Let's get it looked at immediately, right? So let's rewind the clock and imagine what may have happened to his foot. So the moment of impact, okay? Imagine walking across a wooden office floor. You're frustrated. You swing your foot into a cast iron safe. Now, okay, and like we said, that's not the wisest decision. Immediately, thousands of pounds of force are concentrated to that one small area on your toe, right? Or toes. Those men usually wore those those pointy shoes, right? And even if the skin doesn't tear, there is still a tremendous damage, right? That's like momentum, right? The Newton force, it transfers. So tiny, if I got that wrong, physics people, forgive me. So tiny blood vessels rupture, the muscles fibers stretch and tear, ligaments become inflamed, small fractures can occur in the phalanges or the tiny bones that make up the, the toes. Okay, that's what we call it. The blood can leak into the surrounding tissue, forming a hematoma, which is a collection of blood trapped underneath the skin or the nail. The toe can begin to swell. I've seen some pretty bad stubbed toes. And I hate when people say just leave it alone most of the time. Let's say if they have poor blood flow, get vascular on it but it gets infected pretty badly. Like it can blow up to looking like a giant toe. And the toe can be covered in purulence. I'm just imagining one of the ones I've seen, you know? But many pain receptors fire continuously. Let's say if a patient has neuropathy, they wouldn't even pay attention because they have their toe in a shoe, right? And if they don't feel it, they just, won't be able to know that, hey, I have an injury. So this inflammation, like I said, the body's first response is like the inflammation, hemostasis and then inflammation, right? But this inflammation is not the enemy. It's actually your body's first line of repair. So the blood vessels widen to increase circulations. The white blood cells begin migrating towards the injury. The platelets form a clot to help stop the bleeding. Growth factors are released to begin rebuilding the damaged tissue. Most injuries stop here and get to the proliferative stage and start healing and then remodeling, right? But healing depends on one critical factor. The body must have enough oxygen rich blood to help repair. That's why we love vascular so much. If circulation is impaired, healing slows down dramatically. So, did you know that the tips of your toes are among the farthest from your heart? And even in healthy individuals, they still receive less blood than organs like the brain, your kidney, or your liver. So that's why the toes are especially vulnerable to infection because when circulation is compromised, it's even worse then. Okay? Now, like I said, our skin is our invisible suit of armor. So the skin is covering m- much more than everything, our entire body. It's our living, breathing barrier. So every square inch of our skin is home to millions of bacteria. Don't act like you don't have any bacteria on your body. Everybody does. And this may sound alarming, but most of these microorganisms are quite harmless and actually quite beneficial. Okay. That's not somebody telling you to live and not take a shower daily. Okay. I'm not telling that. No. They compete with harmful bacteria and help maintain the natural microbiome of your body and help maintain a healthy skin environment. But as long as the skin remains intact, these bacteria stay where they belong, outside. The problem is that when that barrier is breached, like I said, with a small cut, cracked blister, a torn toe, a puncture wound, or even a microscopic break in the skin, these become entry points. And that's a big thing when it comes to wound healing. We're always looking for the point of entry. When we're like, where did this wound first start? Where did this infection first start? Right? Where did the bacteria finally got its backdoor way in to this person's body? So once the bacteria cross the barrier, they enter the world rich of nutrients and moisture because that's what's keeping us alive, and the conditions allow them to multiply rapidly. So, what are some of the first invaders that most likely would bothersome or harmed him? Okay, so the most common bacteria responsible for skin and soft tissue infections is Staphylococcus aureus. We know that it lives on us, right? And including methicillin resistant strains like MRSA. MRSA didn't exist then, okay? Streptococcus pyogenes, that's the bacterium capable of spreading through soft tissue as well. And in more complex wounds, like our chronic diabetic ulcers, infections often are polymicrobial, involving several types of bacteria, including gram-negative, gram-positive, anaerobes. It's like a whole party in there. So these microorganisms don't simply just sit in the wound. They actually attach to the tissue, tries to damage the tissue. They release enzymes that break down the proteins. They evade the immune system. Some produce toxins that destroy surrounding cells. Others form biofilm, which is like that protective layer. Think of the wall when it comes to Game of Thrones, that slimy protective layer that shields from both antibiotics and the patient's immune system. But it's a microscopic battle that's going on underneath the skin. Okay. So fact or fiction? And y'all should know this answer. If it doesn't hurt, it isn't serious. Absolutely not. Okay. Many people with diabetic neuropathy, like we said, have little to no pain because of their nerve damage. So they are not able to feel severe infections like a person who doesn't have neuropathy. And pain is not a reliable measure of how dangerous a foot wound is, especially in patients who have diabetes. Now, the body fighting back. So, as bacteria continues to multiply, the immune system responds. The neutrophils, the body's rapid response white blood cells arrive first. Yay. Their mission is simple: find the bacteria, engulf them, destroy them. They release reactive oxygen molecules and digestive enzymes designed to kill invading microbes. Now, another great member of the team, the macrophages soon arrive. They clean up the dead cells, they orchestrate the next phase of healing. If the immune system wins, the infection resolves, the redness fades, the swelling decreases, new tissue forms because you're in the proliferative stage now, and the wound heals. But what if the bacteria gains the upper hand? So let's talk about when blood flow is not enough. Like we said, one of the most important parts of wound healing is blood flow. That's why we like vascular so much. We love vascular. We need vascular. Okay. So blood delivers oxygen, nutrients, immune cells, antibiotics. Without adequate circulation, even the most powerful medications struggle to reach the infected tissue. That's why it's even extremely hard if the patient has PAD and let's say they have a foot infection, they have blockages in their lower extremity arteries. How is that going to any oral, even IV, how is that going to get to that foot appropriately? Probably not because it's already blocked, okay? So it's extremely hard when you have poor circulation. And this is particularly important for our patients who have peripheral arterial disease, diabetes, chronic kidney disease, and smoking related vascular disease. Because when blood flow is reduced, the tissue becomes starved. That's why we love vascular, and cells begin to die. So we need vascular to reverse all of that, okay? We need them to do their magic, okay? And dead tissue becomes an ideal environment for bacteria. This is the beginning of a dangerous cycle. Poor circulation leads to tissue death. Dead tissue, l- bacteria loves dead tissue. That's another thing I've noticed. Dead tissue, bacteria loves it. Bacteria can cause more inflammation. Inflammation increases swelling. Further swelling reduces blood flow, okay? And the cycle continues. So what if Jack Daniels had diabetes? There's no record of him having it, okay? To be honest. So we simply don't know. There's no documented evidence that Jack Daniels had diabetes. He most likely he didn't, okay? No physician, no, I'm sure they would have put it there, okay, if he did. No family accounts of describing excessive thirst, unexplained weight loss, or any other classic symptoms. Could he have had undiagnosed diabetes? Uh, I think less likely, but the possibility, but it's less likely. So in the early 1900s, diabetes was often underdiagnosed and effective treatments such as insulin were not available as yet. So we cannot diagnose based on speculation, but what we do know that even without diabetes, a severe foot infection can be deadly before even without medical intervention and antibiotics. So did you know insulin was not successfully used to treat patients until 1922? That is very young. That's more than a decade after Jack Daniels died. Remember, he died in 1911. So remember, for many people living with diabetes in 1911, the disease was often fatal. So what do we do when tissue dies? So as infection progresses, the body's smallest blood vessels begin to clot. The infection the tissue, the affected tissue receives less oxygen and cells stop producing energy efficiently. And then membranes break down, they rupture, and this is what we call a process of necrosis. Necrosis is irreversible tissue death. Necrotic tissue cannot heal, it cannot defend itself, it becomes a breeding ground for bacteria, right? Kind of like the movie. Oh, I want to use the movie Gremlins. Never mind. And once it occurs, the infection often accelerates dramatically. So what is gangrene? Okay, this is a pet. I think people use this word a little too loosely. Okay, gangrene is not net fash. Okay, simple as that. Okay, the word gangrene often conjures with dramatic changes of a blackened limb, right? But gangrene is not a disease itself; it's a result of tissue death. So several forms. There's dry gangrene and wet gangrene. I always tell people there's a huge difference. That there's a problem because when you say it's dry gangrene, when it's actually wet gangrene, we have a problem and time is tissue and that misdiagnosis, you're trying to kill somebody with that because if you're saying it's not. And then there's also gas gangrene. So dry gangrene, that's usually caused by poor blood flow. Tissues, the tissue is dry. That's why they call it dry gangrene. Okay. It shrivels up and it turns black. Infection may not be initially present on dry gangrene. May not. Okay. Another thing, and then sometimes dry gangrene, sometimes people leave it to demarcate so they can see where the cell death ends, okay? Now, wet gangrene, that is quite dangerous. If any part of that gangrene is wet, moist, dripping, anything, it's wet gangrene in my book, okay? So the tissue becomes swollen, it gets foul smelling. If it's loose, it produces drainage without prompt treatment. Wet gangrene can spread rapidly and lead to sepsis, okay? I don't understand why people don't understand the difference between wet and dry. Put your hand in water, keep the left hand outside. That's the difference. Wet and dry. Now, another thing that we see quite often is gas gangrene, a rare one, but extremely aggressive infection that is caused by actually gas gangrene can be caused by quite a few different bacterium, but we usually say Clostridium bacterium, but there are many organisms that can produce toxins and gas within tissue and cause rapid destruction. And as we know, gas gangrene is one of the medical emergencies. So, while gas gangrene was very unlikely for Jack Daniels, it does illustrate how devastating certain infections can become. Now, by now, the infection is no longer confined to the toe. The body's defense system is overwhelmed, the battle is spreading, and in the early 1900s, physicians called this blood poisoning. Like I said, I know the word very well because that's what they put on my grandmother's death certificate. The hospital discharged her, and she died shortly after because they discharged her while she had sepsis. That's what they did because that's negligence, in my opinion. If anybody thinks discharging somebody while they had sepsis and blood poisoning is not negligence, yeah, tell me how it's not. Okay? 'Cause they're supposed to do labs on you before you get discharged to make sure your white blood cell count is good, that you're stable, right? That's the whole point of discharge. You're medically stable for discharge, right? Okay then. But I guess, when there is a group of people who don't care in the healthcare system, I guess people's families' lives don't mean much to them, right? And we just hope that, people are able to identify and call out those people. I do believe in huge accountability. A lot of people do not like to be accountable for their bad decisions and not caring about people's lives. Every person's life is extremely valuable. I don't Everybody's life is extremely valuable, in my opinion. Okay. I know people have their own, but in healthcare, that's Hippocratic oath. Okay. And if you're just being negligent and just doing your own thing, getting your little lunch break, not caring, I think that discharging a patient when they're not medically stable is negligent. Okay. And if you're a healthcare provider, you should know when somebody's medically stable or not. You should have actual protocol, okay? And if you don't have a protocol, what are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing? You just discharging, letting people go left, right, and center and just dying at home, right? I was a little girl when that happened, when my grandmother died in the bedroom next to me, right? Because they didn't know what they were doing, right? Because they just discharged her. We're thinking little girl, you're like, oh yeah, she came back from the hospital. She must be all better. Nope. It's a blood poisoning. I'm like, what? When I found out what that was, and I found that out in medical school, I realized that those people were negligent to my grandma. But side note, let's get back to it. Now, myth or fact? You need a large wound to have a serious infection. Absolutely not. Okay. Even the smallest wounds, a tiny opening, especially in a patient who has diabetes or poor circulation, can allow bacteria to enter and it can become a limb threatening disease. An infection begins, okay? So you have to understand microorganisms, they love the body, even if it's bacteria, fungi, or even viruses, okay? So a small cut can become infected, pneumonia can develop, UTIs, and diabetic foot ulcers, okay? Now, another thing when it comes to blood poisoning and sepsis, your immune system overreacts. So the immune system releases these chemicals called cytokines to help fight the infection. And in sepsis, the response becomes uncontrolled. So the blood vessels become inflamed, they actually become leaky, blood pressure drops, they become hypotensive. Unfortunately, that's what happened to my dad as well. Blood flow to organs become impaired, and the body's defense system starts causing damage to its own tissue. And honestly, anybody who has really great healthcare providers and healthcare hospitals, y'all are very lucky. Y'all don't understand how bad it could be in certain countries. Now, bloodstream and organs are affected when you're having sepsis or aka blood poisoning. So when bacteria and their toxins enter the bloodstream, they can trigger a widespread inflammation. The body may develop circulatory problems, low blood pressure, poor oxygen delivery to tissue. Another thing is during sepsis, you can have clotting problems like tiny blood clots form in the small vessels, the platelets and the clotting factors become depleted, and then organ dysfunction, that's a big thing. The kidneys may stop filtering properly, the lungs may struggle to oxygenate the blood, the heart becomes stressed, and the brain becomes quite confused. Remember I did an episode about that because that's why it's really good to know your patients. Like I said, you can notice if somebody has an altered or confused mindset because you're like, I'll never forget it happened to me. I was like, he's not acting normal. I was like, this one patient, he was not acting. I told them, I said, something's wrong. Something is wrong. Nobody believed me. One thing I have learned or noticed whenever I say something and I'm like, I don't just say anything just to say it. If I say and I tell somebody, I say, I think this is what's going on, it usually ends up being that looking at the people who didn't believe. And I'm like, why didn't you believe me? Is it just because of my voice? Is it too high pitched? I don't know. So, another thing, septic shock. So, the most severe stage, if sepsis progress, people become septic. They get septic shock. I think that kind of happened to my dad too. So, this occurs, blood pressure remains dangerously low despite they try to do fluids, right? And then the organs are not receiving enough oxygen. Medications like pressors may be needed to help raise the blood flow, but without rapid treatment, septic shock can be quite fatal. Now, how do we arrive from this when it comes to like this is diabetes foot files, right? We see that happen a lot often enough, okay? Diabetic foot infections can cause sepsis. How does that happen? Because, our patients are neuropathic, okay? They may prevent somebody from feeling if the infection gets worse. Poor circulation can limit your immune system response and the antibiotic delivery. Bacteria can travel deeper into the tissue. Infection can reach the bone, aka causing osteomyelitis, and delayed recognition allows infection to spread. So a small looking wound can sometimes become a serious infection underneath. That's why, if anything, that's why we tell diabetic patients, look at your feet every day. So what are some of the warning signs of possible sepsis? Fever, low temperature, fast heart rate, fast breathing, confusion, unusual sleepiness, extreme weakness, low blood pressure, dizziness, fainting, decreased urine output. The skin can become molted, pale, or unusually cool, right? And sepsis is an actual medical emergency, okay? This is not some time to get lunch, okay? This isn't time to fight over the schedule, okay? This is time to save a life. Okay, I need people to prioritize this. Okay, stop thinking about yourself when you're at work. Okay, rapid antibiotics. This is when infection is suspected. So they should know how to do this because you pass exams, right? IV fluids, oxygen support if needed, source control. So if there's an abscess, removing infected tissue, debridement of infected wounds, and blood pressure support in severe cases. Like my friend is very lucky. One of my friends who her father, they when he was at a different hospital in his home country, they were like, "Oh, there's nothing we could do. We can't get a CT, whatever." And, they flew him to a whole different country, which is a better country, and they did the CT and he had an abscess. This man could have died if he stayed in that hospital. But that's what that hospital does. And this is less than 2 months ago. But thank God he's alive, almost fully recovered, happy, ready. Look at the change because he changed the hospital. The children changed the hospital, right? You should be aware when you it's here's the thing. I think people who are poor who don't care about patients or poor practitioners, they like to prey on people being ignorant. They like to pray that the patient doesn't know what's going on. They'd be like, "Oh, this is supposed to happen." And you're like, if somebody has a family member in healthcare, right? They usually bring them with them because then they're able to be like, "This is not right. This Why is he not talking anymore? Why is it getting red? Why is it getting smell?" And people who don't know, right? The practitioners, let's say if they don't care or they're not well versed in wound care, they'll be like, "Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. This is okay." I've seen that multiple times. I've seen people lie multiple times to people and their family because hoping that they don't know or hoping that they don't understand or making the patient feel like this is their fault. It's not their fault, okay? So, let me finish. For diabetic foot infections, controlling the source of infection, like Dr. Chu said, source control is extremely important, just as important as antibiotics. Removing the necrotic tissue, the draining pus, the infected bone, and helping restore blood flow as needed, which is why we love vascular, okay? So, what was Jack Daniels' final days like? Okay, so there are no nursing notes, there's no laboratory reports, there's no hospital charts, there's no even official autopsy describing his organs. But based on the historical accounts and our understanding of the severe infection, we can make a medically informed observation that he may have experienced things like he might likely developed increasing pain that affected his foot, unless, the advancing tissue death reduced his sensation. As the infection spread, the fever and chills appeared. His appetite most likely declined. We've seen that a lot with patients when they have a severe infection. Fatigue would have increased. Walking would have become extremely difficult. As sepsis progressed, people usually become quite weak, dehydrated, and confused. Family members may have noticed that this person isn't thinking clearly. His breathing may have become faster as the body is trying to compensate for the worsening circulation and the heightened metabolic stress. Pulse likely accelerated, and eventually, if septic shock developed, the blood pressure would have fallen, and without modern intensive care, these changes would become irreversible. So it's important to emphasize that this reconstruction is based on modern medical understanding of severe sepsis and historical reports of his illness, not a surviving clinical record. Okay. So, what did his death certificate say? So, many people search for Jack Daniels' autopsy report, and here's the truth: there is no verified official autopsy report available in historical record. I couldn't find one. But likewise, there is no detailed pathological examination that has been published either. So, historical sources generally state that Jack Daniels died October 9th, 1911, after complications related to gangrene and blood poisoning. At that time, blood poisoning, like I said, was a common term used by physicians for overwhelming systemic infection that we now classify as sepsis. Because the medical documentation from that era is limited, historians continue to debate whether the famous safe kicking incident, kicking the safe with his foot, caused the fatal infection or whether it became just part of a legend over time. I mean, maybe it was not gonna say. What what's not to dispute is that there was an infection that ultimately caused the decline and his death, okay? So what lesson can we learn today? You don't have to own a whiskey distillery to for this story to matter. Every week podiatrists, vascular surgeons, wound care specialists, endocrinologists, primary care physicians, we see patients who delay seeking care for what they believe was just a sore on their toe, right? They were just like, I thought it was nothing, all right? Sometimes the outcome is excellent, sometimes the outcome is not. But the difference, most likely, between the outcomes is one word: time. Okay? So the earlier an infection is recognized, the more options we have. And the longer somebody waits, the fewer options remain. And unfortunately, Jack Daniels lived in an era where medicine simply didn't have the tools that we have today. And the tragedy is that many people still lose their limbs and lives, not because of modern treatments don't exist, because care is delayed and also, not prepared, to be honest, okay? So what happened if story could be rewritten for Jack Daniels? What if Jack Daniels walked into a state of art, let's say limb saving center or even just a hospital today? What tests would they have ordered? What antibiotics would they have chosen? What, would they have saved the toe? Would they have saved his foot? Would they have saved his life? I mean, the possibilities are endless. What could have happened? His life probably could have been saved, right? But what is the lesson today? Like we said, every year, us people, the people in diabetic foot clinics, we see patients with the same thing. It was only a bump. It was only a blister. I thought it would heal. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it doesn't. Okay, but the often difference, like I said, is time. The difference often comes down to the blood flow, the immune function, the bacterial virulence, and how quickly treatment begins and recognized, diagnosed, right? And seemingly a trivial injury can become a medical emergency. We see this often, okay, when factors align in the wrong direction. And that's why this Jack Daniels story with the kicking the safe with the foot, even though it might be a legend, maybe not, maybe there it continues to resonate a century later, more than a century later, okay? And it reminds us that even the smallest wounds and smallest little injuries deserve respect. And I hope everybody liked this episode of Diabetic Foot Files. I'm Dr. G, and take care of your feet because they take care of you. And don't stub your toe. And if you do, go to podiatry.